take on a board of advisor, you want somebody who is an expert and has nearly invaluable knowledge. You want people who have world-class networks, and you need somebody who's not shy.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Entrepreneurship 101 and tonight's session on governance and building a board of a board. Before we get started tonight, I just wanted to give a shout out to the groups that are watching on webcast. We've got a group watching, a Haltech group watching from Sheridan College, and we also have a group out in Hamilton at the Innovation Factory watching. So we're glad that they could join us. I've heard through the grapevine and Twitter that there's a number of people also coming watching from Communitech and in Waterloo, because we have one of their own speaking tonight, David Litwiller, who is an executive in residence at Communitech. Anybody here who's in particularly the ICT space, if you haven't been to Communitech yet or checked out any of their events in Waterloo, I really recommend it. It's such a vibrant community, the Communitech Hub. In fact, tomorrow, the majority of my team is going to their tech leadership conference. They've got fantastic speakers, including Seth Godin, who's always a crowd favorite. But they have events all year, peer-to-peer groups, tons of big events, and it's really a fun trip out to check out all the innovation happening out there. So to get started, and one really important announcement is next week we don't have any Entrepreneurship 101. So please don't show up unless you want to see a group of 13 to 15-year-olds working on business ideas, because that's what we'll be doing next week, is the Mars Future Leaders program. And with that, I'd like to introduce David Litwiller, our presenter tonight. He is a director, advisor, and consultant to many early and growth stage companies. Since 2011, he's been an executive in residence at Communitech, where he advises on strategy, finance, general management, and governance for startups. A couple years before that, he was the COO of enterprise software developer in digital marketing in the clinical messaging sector. And previously, he had a variety of positions, including executive positions with a semiconductor and electro-optic instrumentation producer. It is his first time speaking, I think, at Mars and as part of the Entrepreneurship 101 program. So please extend a very warm welcome to David.
Thank you, Carrie, and good evening, everyone. It's great to be here in Toronto speaking to the Entrepreneurship 101 program. When I considered how to give the talk tonight to make it interesting and valuable both for this session as well as the overall body of knowledge that's building up through the 101 series, I had the opportunity to review last year's presentation on the basics of a board of directors and a board of advisors. And I finished watching it and I said, wow, that was fantastic. I really don't know what else I can say. What I'm going to do this evening is talk a little bit more about the next steps in building a board of directors and a board of advisors, because there already is a very good piece of collateral that you can look at to run through the basics. And my purpose in doing that is by having that look ahead at what getting the most out of a board of directors or out of a board of advisors is going to look like slightly down the line with your earlier growth stage venture. You have a new and hopefully valuable vantage point on how to get the most out of it in the here and now, both with the type of people that you would engage with as well as how you would operate either of those types of forums. There will be 4 parts to the talk. The first thing we'll do is cover the difference between a board of directors and a board of advisors. They are quite distinct in their roles and responsibilities. We will then do a drill down into what the duties of directors are and the related responsibilities, because they are significant and directors have a very different and more onerous task than those of advisors. We'll talk about how to build, manage, and evaluate each type of board for maximum impact, and then we'll talk about how you evolve governance at the speed of a rapidly growing and changing business. So right to the distinction between a board of directors and a board of advisors. So the choice of members in each body is made by a different group. In the case of directors, they are nominated by current directors, but they are ultimately chosen by the shareholders, whereas advisors are chosen by and chosen for the convenience of management. In the case of a board of directors, they oversee the business affairs of the corporation, whereas advisors can be used on an ad hoc basis to advise as requested. In the case of directors, they have a large and growing number of obligations under statute and case law, whereas on the whole, advisors do not. In the case of the board of directors, they set their own agenda for meetings, whereas advisors work to an agenda that is set by management. The power to hire and fire. The board has the obligation to hire and fire the CEO as well as to appoint the other executive officers of the corporation, whereas advisors, again, generally do not. The duties of the board of directors have specific legal definition with a fiduciary duty as well as a duty of care, and we'll talk about what that is more in a few minutes. Whereas advisors do not. In the case of a board of directors, there is compulsory disclosure of business information so that management cannot shield certain types of business information from the board of directors, whereas in the case of an advisory board, it's at the election of management what type and how much of business information will be disclosed. And then the time commitment. In the case of a board of directors, as a practical matter, with an up-and-coming growth stage company, today we're talking about 250 hours a year as a baseline. And if you're doing committee work and or potentially even chairmanship, you're talking about something that's closer to 450 hours a year. And in that case, you're looking at a situation where an hour in the boardroom will be matched by 2 hours outside of the boardroom on side conversations, research, other forms of deliberation, so that what you see in the boardroom is increasingly just the tip of the iceberg of what the overall time and commitment of a fiduciary director is. And whereas in the case of a less formal advisory board, the time commitment is very flexible and it's just whatever is mutually agreed upon. So to understand why the obligations of the board of directors are so significant, I'm going to run through very quickly what the laundry list of requirements are. They have to prepare for each meeting. There is a legal obligation they are under to be prepared. They have to appoint the CEO and other executive officers. They need to, related to that, monitor and evaluate CEO performance. And for anybody who's ever had to manage any employee, knowing the time commitment that goes into that management role, let alone doing it for the CEO, who is synonymous with the enterprise that they are leading. Often they're the founder. It's a very time-consuming duty to do well. As the board of directors, you have to plan for succession of the CEO and for others in senior management. The cold hard fact of life is that the half-life of a CEO of an earlier growth stage company is generally about 3 years. So succession is not a distant or remote possibility. The board needs to adopt a strategic planning process, and then it needs to be very participative and collaborative with management in developing and that strategy, and ultimate flowing down to an annual business plan as well as a multi-year strategic plan. Further board obligations, having to review with management financial plans, and this is not just a cursory blessing of a few highlight numbers in the financial plan. This is understanding at a very deep level what the gearing of the financial model is, getting into the main assumptions and dependencies of the business plan, and spending a lot of time talking and deliberating about the quality of those assumptions and dependencies. establishing operating and financial goals, and then establishing the sufficiency of risk management. And the definition of risk management in a practical matter changes considerably as a company grows. Very early on, in a pre-revenue mode, risk management is to a large extent about making sure you're not going to run out of money. In the case of biotech or pharma, you may be dealing with how you manage risk around how certain trials are done, given that there are attendant human or other types of risks to what you're doing. There's also reviewing and approving financial statements, especially as the number of investors in the business grows, approving material acquisitions and divestitures, approving any securities issuances and repurchases, and declaring dividends. And to finish out the list of board of directors' obligations, they have to themselves approve the nomination of new directors. In that respect, the board of directors is a self-regulating body. The board has to confirm that processes are in place to comply with all applicable legal, regulatory, corporate, securities, and other compliance matters that may be relevant to a particular business or industry sector. The board has to develop the corporation's approach to corporate governance, and that means that the processes that are appropriate for corporate governance change as the corporation grows and develops greater numbers of stakeholders who have greater investment in what the enterprise is set out to achieve. And then the board has to further carry out other duties that can be specified by contract through the unanimous shareholders agreement, the articles or bylaws of the corporation. So all this is to say, this is why being a director or as an entrepreneur, taking on having a board of directors is a very significant consideration for all sides. It can add a lot of value to a corporation. It can help a company get further and faster, and it can be a tremendous resource for the founders and early team. But there's a lot to consider on both sides of the equation. Now, in terms of the legal duties of directors, there's a character and a way of doing their work that directors by law are obligated to conduct themselves. The first is called the fiduciary duty, which means that directors will be honest, they will be loyal to the corporation above any other one constituency of the corporation. They will be loyal to the corporation itself and serve the best interests of the corporation overall. And that can change dramatically depending on circumstances, how one defines that. They have to fulfill trust. They have to maintain confidence. They have to show independent judgment. It is not enough to be a yes person on a board of directors. You have to show independence of thought and action. You have to be documented as having done so to show that you're fulfilling your duties as an individual director and that collectively the directorate is fulfilling its duties. And the directors have to avoid conflicts of interest to fill out their requirements of fiduciary duty. In addition, there's a duty of care, which is that they have to act carefully. They have to be informed, and we'll talk more about exactly what these mean in a few minutes. And they have to exhibit diligence and skill appropriate to the circumstances. As well, the directors have certain standards of performance that they have to exercise as they carry out their duties and obligations. The first is that they will exercise due diligence, which means that they will seek appropriate information and review it. They will be deliberative in the processes that they undertake individually and as a group, that they will seek out and rely on experts and independent authorities when that's appropriate, and they will record those behaviors in the proceedings of the board, which is through the minutes of the boards or the committees. And that they will show the business judgment of a reasonable person under the circumstances that they were acting under at the time. So what this all means is The reality of being a director or having a board of directors is that it is work, and people need to be work-like about it. This is not just a nice symbolic role. This is not something that you toss to a friend of yours as reciprocity for something that they may have done for you early on. This is real work. There are real risks. The liabilities are significant for the directors. They are individually on the hook for many of the liabilities of the corporation, particularly if they do not execute their duties appropriately. The board is under a requirement to be collectively knowledgeable about the salient aspects of the business and its context. Individual directors can be more narrow in skill. You're not going to have all directors being equally expert about all aspects of the business, but collectively the directorate has to be knowledgeable about all of the main aspects of the business. The directors need to be engaged and active contributors, and as I mentioned before, they have to be documented as such. And you need directors that are suitable in risk tolerance to the stage of the business. You can't have hyper-conservative people as directors of a very early stage, volatile, risky enterprise. You need to find people who have a risk appetite and tolerance that matches the stage of development of the business. And the last thing that I would sort of say is one of the leading realities of being a director of an early stage company is that there is very little staff support within the management of the company that's available to support directors. This isn't like blue chip company governance where there are several executives typically who have a main or leading responsibility to support the board and certain committees. In the case of a very young company, little to no board support is available, so there's a lot of work and a lot of roll up your sleeves and just get it done as a director because there's really nobody else that's able to do it for you. Now, for a young company that has a board of directors, especially a rapidly growing, rapidly changing company, the board needs to evolve quickly because the business will evolve quickly. And so a few things that I would highlight as being illustrative. These aren't really a complete list of all the things that will help do that, but they give you a flavor with some quantification of what this needs to be. You typically are looking at term limits of 3 years. It's not unusual that after 3 years, you've probably gotten as much mileage out of a good director as you can. And if the business is performing well and executing on a rapid growth trajectory, at that time, it's likely that most directors will need to be renewed. There can be renewals of term limits, but in general, you want to be thinking about a 3-year term limit. It takes ongoing networking by directors and officers of the company, the executive officers, to develop director candidates. You're not going to find the right people in the right circumstances if you wait till the last minute. This is something that takes months and in some cases years to be able to find the convergence of the right people, the right interests, the right opportunity, and the timing with your business. So there needs to be a wide net that's being cast all the time to identify promising potential director candidates. And the board needs to periodically assess itself to identify its own weaknesses individually and as a group. And then do that gap identification and analysis as the basis for targeting what skill profiles and what nominees and what improved practices in board operation the board will adopt in the future. A further perspective on the way that the board will typically evolve, and forgive me, this is a bit of an eye chart, but these things are important. So at the inception of the business, when it first incorporates as a private company, it's only obligated to have one director, and typically that is one of the founders. The main skill at that juncture for the board is business formation itself, friends, family, and founder funding as the leading way that early funds are sourced. And the right way to go about early customer and technical discovery. As the company develops further to what we would traditionally categorize as seed or startup stage, where it has a few employees, it's now brought in some money, it likely has ambitions to bring in much more in the near future. The board would expand to about 3 people as an average case, 1 founder, 1 lead outside investor, and 1 independent director. And the skills at that point for the board and for the leadership overall is recruiting new employees, it's developing the technology, it's starting to develop some disciplines around operations, the ability to attract additional angel or VC funding, and then the ecosystem relationship development as are relevant to drive the business over the next 12 to 18 months. Moving on from there, we would categorize that as a growth stage business. At that point, we're talking about early revenue. We're now talking about somewhere between 10 and 20 employees. And at that juncture, you would normally have about 5 directors, 2 founders, 2 investors, and 1 independent. And the skill of the board is about commercialization. It's about further operational refinement. It's about institutionalizing know-how so that the business is bigger and more durable than just the founders or a few key early employees. And it's about scaling and growth finance and working capital management and increasingly internationalization. And then the final stage that I'll talk about for the purposes of this evening's talk is what I would call late expansion. At this point, the business is likely sustaining its own growth out of cash flows. And the board at that point would likely be about 7 people, with the big difference being an increase in the number of independent directors. And the emphasis of the board is now shifting to capturing the value that all the work before has helped to create, whether that be through IPO or acquisition, developing the refinement of governance discipline suitable to a company at that stage, so that a potential acquirer doesn't realize or doesn't feel that a lot of remedial work needs to be baked into and discounted from the price. And in general, you're trying to operate a business at that point that is proving to itself and proving to other stakeholders that it can have very few surprises and it really can execute to a plan. Just to give you a flavor at a functional level of how some of these things change, I won't go into each of these, but this sort of speaks to the risk tolerance of the kind of directors that are appropriate to be working with at different stages. And I'll just pick the accounting example as one of the things that the board is involved with. And very early on, cash is king, and really you're just managing by the bank statements. And so you have the right directors if they're able and willing to work with you on something as basic as that as the principal measure of financial performance and outlook. At the startup stage, the company probably has a part-time bookkeeper. There likely is a monthly income statement and balance sheet of some form. Tax returns are being done and source deductions are being made and remitted. And the board is staying on top of making sure that all of that is happening. By the time we get to growth stage, the company likely has a full-time CFO. It is getting or is close to getting audited financial statements. The company is now able to generate an annual forecast that has predictive value, and a significant part of financial monitoring and reporting at a board level is talking about variance review and interpretation review. Now, in terms of how we get highest productivity out of the board, this is an area where I probably get the most calls by far from client companies and the people I work with where they want some help, where they've got a board, they're at some stage of development that's in the spectrum that we're talking about this evening, and frankly, the founders or the early investors just feel like they're not getting enough out of the board, and they want to know how to get more productivity out of that body that's sector and stage appropriate to the business. And so the leading practices that I've gotten the most mileage from when I've introduced these with boards, at the seed and the startup stage, prospective hindsight. And this is where we ask the directors to get in the habit on major decisions of routinely asking themselves, if this decision turns out to have failed a year from now, do the thought experiment about why it failed based on what you know today, what the unresolved or insufficiently explored risks were that were known or knowable today, and how would that change your thinking about the type of inquiry that you would make now or the type of options that you would hold open for the business. A second practice is reference class analysis, which is where we encourage people, no matter how successful they've been in the past in other endeavors, to set their ego aside, to assume that their intuition is worth not much, and to do the work of examining what the experience has been of similar or adjacent companies developing similar technologies through similar go-to-market strategies in the recent past. And typically what happens is when people build up a substantial number of experiences like that of companies where they've profiled the history of how they performed and what their strategic drivers were, and what mistakes they made, they tend to develop a very different set of priorities and ways of thinking about the present business that can be very healthy. A third thing that can really help the productivity of the board is pre-commitment. And the idea is that none of us learns very much if we can't really remember how we thought something was going to come out before we undertook that project. And boards of directors and individual directors are as guilty as anybody that if a decision is made at one moment in time and then a year later the outcomes of that decision are being examined, people tend to interpret what their thoughts were about that original decision, influenced by what ultimately came out. And encouraging directors, at least in their private working notes, to be writing down for themselves about what they think the right thing to do in certain situations are as the basis for their own private feedback even, let alone among the whole group, can do a lot to help people's learning about themselves and being humble about how they can best contribute and how fast they need to learn to contribute most significantly to a business. And the last practice for the very early stage business is what we call commitment limits, which is the idea that you don't get into any risky endeavor without knowing what your limit of commitment is to the initial path that you adopt. And by having people be honest with themselves about what the appropriate limit of commitment is at the outset of any major new project. In the case of a young company, we're developing a new product line, or we're thinking about whether we're going to go after a second application market in parallel with our first application market rather than serializing them. You want to think about and have people document in their own working papers what the appropriate limit of commitment is for that endeavor. All of these things serve to help manage risk. They improve the coaching and coachability of the board and the board with respect to management. It helps learning. It antidotes groupthinks. It can help pivots to be done better and faster. As we like to say, pivot without a divot when the time for that comes. So there's a basket of techniques that you can think about having in your repertoire for how to get the most out of a very early stage board. At growth stage, when the company is further along, the highest impact practices include all of the above, but it typically grows to include a number of things. Executive sessions where the directors who are not part of management meet in addition to the full board meetings to talk about how the board is performing and to provide and to discuss how they feel management is performing and then provide that feedback. And then the effort on the agenda itself. The agenda is one of the most powerful tools that the board of directors has to shape the discussions and the deliberation and the type of information that it gets from management. The board has to spend a lot of time on just preparing the agenda to be able to fulfill its duties. And then a little later on in the company, we get into other types of board practices. One is the continuous improvement of governance itself, and the idea there is it's not enough to just govern well. Intrinsic to governing well is taking responsibility for the ongoing improvement of governance practices. It's much like a lean methodology restated in the terms of governance. And as the board gets larger and as the board itself has been operating for a longer period of time, there is going to be more renewal of the board and new people joining the board, and there needs to be methodical director onboarding and training so that they get to full productivity fast, and by extension the board. I'm going to give you some sort of raw advice. This is an editorial piece about how to really make a board work. For directors, there is just no shortcut for spending the time and doing a lot of reading. Even directors that have been successful in the past in domain, the world changes fast, and if they're going to keep up with how they can best provide context and input to a rapidly growing young company, they need to be spending a lot of time reading so that they can bring an informed, independent viewpoint. And it's not an accident that those same words that are built back into some of the duties and legal obligations of the directors are there. This is not something where you can just come into a board meeting and fly by the seat of your pants and have any hope of convincing yourself or anyone else that you've done your job. I would argue that the speed, decisiveness, and dexterity of the board improves at the margin by having a slightly smaller board than larger, simply because there's fewer voices. It's easier to get to consensus, but there's a big if and only if you can get sufficiently broad and experienced and dedicated directors who are willing and able to span all the requisite disciplines. If that's not the case, then you tend to end up having to go for a slightly larger board to get the range of skills that you need, and you have to take on the added overhead of that to make it all work. On the frequency of meeting, I would say meet 8 times per year, and the meetings have to be in person to be able to convey the body language through which much of the information in those types of meetings needs to come. Telephone meetings are okay for final decisions if all of the facts and arguments are largely on the table and have been discussed in person before, but other than very, very perfunctory kind of steps, board meetings need to be in person. And don't let the flurry of other business that's going on every meeting push aside a deep dive into exploring with the CEO and the senior financial person what is keeping them up at night. Make sure that you are having that mind meld as a board of directors with what the leading executives of the enterprise are being kept awake with, because that's where most of the discussion needs to be. Get board packages out to the directors 72 hours in advance. Good directors are typically busy people. If you get them a package 4 hours before the meeting, they won't have time to review it, and nobody's getting anything out of the process, and people are introducing more risk than they should. The reading packages have to go out a few days in advance. Moreover, there needs to be a cover memo jointly authored by the CEO and the chairman of the board, which identifies which matters are informational only, which matters will be deliberated, and which ones will require decisions at the upcoming meeting. In general, the discussion should be structured so that management's recommendations are clear, but that there is still room for director input. At the same time, the range of options shouldn't be so wide that the possibilities that the directors are facing are nearly unbounded. In general, you want to have a finite but distinct range of possibilities so that you can have a productive discussion, but get through things in a reasonable amount of time. At every board meeting, there should be a discussion item about the quality of information that's come from the company, the agenda, the time allocation on the different items that were discussed, and the deliberation process, with each director responsible for contributing 1 or 2 improvements for future meetings. And again, with management absent, there should be an executive session, or sometimes these are known as in-camera sessions, at the end of every board meeting to discuss both the board's performance and management, and then to provide that feedback immediately to management if there is such feedback. There's a reciprocal piece of feedback, which is from time to time, the board needs to ask management where management is getting frustrated by the help that it's getting from the board. You know, it's a two-way street that there needs to be give and take. I would generally counsel that in regular circumstances, you spend 75% of your time looking forward to the future in what the board discusses and deliberates, and 25% looking back at finance and routine operations. As always, and I'm sure you've heard this many times in many places, especially at the earlier stages, you've got to know what the company's financial runway is at all times. You've got to be proactive about raising funds. And the board needs to become expert in accessing alternatives both in the company's financial model as well as its capital structure to improve its funding options. Rotate which board members will take a hard stand on difficult issues so that one person doesn't always become the critic or take that role. That tends to keep up the health of relationships and interactions much better. And boards love to forget or always get pressed for time on CEO performance feedback. I find it helps a lot to have one director. It can be on a rotating basis, but at any one moment in time, there is one director that is responsible for leading the rest of the board through that process. All of the board will contribute, but there is one person who's on point to make sure that performance evaluation gets done and the feedback gets to the CEO on a timely and recurring basis. A number of things about chairing the board of directors, and these are a number of traits that the chairman, and that can be chairperson, but the tone of the board is set by the chair. It's leadership among peers. It requires an incredible amount of tact. It's about bringing everybody into the discussion and not letting people stay silent. It's being able to encourage debate while sustaining cohesion. It's about keeping conflict at a task level and not letting it elevate to a relationship level. It's about taking the time to sound out individual directors and participating executive management about their leading concerns before each meeting. And there's, one of the hardest things, and I'll just jump to the end of this list, is the chair is also responsible for dealing with director underperformance. We're talking about small companies that don't have separate governance committees. So in the case of small company boards, generally it's the chair that has to deal with directors that aren't giving it the right effort, aren't coming prepared, simply are in over their heads. Come to terms with that and make sure that everybody has both oars in the water on behalf of the business. I won't spend a lot of time this evening, but for the purposes of what you can look at later and just a resource that you can look at, I have given what I consider to be some of the highest correlation early predictors of board issues. If you see these, it typically is time to act and act pretty fast. But when you see these types of issues emerging from a board, the time for change is now. This is not something to take a wait-and-see attitude with. Another topic that I've put some materials here for your benefit is the question of board observers. Sometimes certain investors or other constituencies in the business will say, well, we don't want all the headache that goes with being on the board of directors, but we want to see what's happening in the meetings and be apprised at that level and in real time of how the business is performing. There's a number of issues with that to be aware of. It's done routinely, but be aware that in a small company board where generally the boards reach consensus, having a vote, or I should say having a voice, is nearly as powerful as having a vote. So to take on an observer that has any right of participation at all other than that of a passive observer is a significant implication for the business and for the board, so don't take that on casually. And we'll finish up quickly now with talking about a board of advisors. So this is a different type of board. It does not have the fiduciary obligations of a board of directors. It's not under the same legal obligations as we talked about at the outset. And this is a group that is able to provide independent advice to the CEO or management without all of those obligations. It can be a great benefit for a company in the ability of those advisors to advise as well as to lend credibility to the company, especially in the areas most significant to success over the coming years. Typically, you look to work with between 4 and 7 advisors. There's no hard and fast rules on that. There's no legal obligations. But more often than not, the number of advisors fall into that range. Boards of advisors can take 3 common forms. One is a customer advisory board, where you're trying to get more voice of the customer into what the company is doing, especially into product strategy, where there are long product development cycles. You can have a scientific or technical advisory board where there's very deep science, very deep physical science that's involved with bringing the company's value to a commercializable form. And generally then a catch-all of business advisory boards to seek any and all advice that are helpful to building the business. And that can be in finance, it can be in partnership development, it can be in organizational building or anything else. If you're going to take on a board of advisor member, you want somebody who is an expert and has nearly invaluable knowledge. Even these types of roles are not ones to be handed out lightly. You want people who have world-class networks. They need to be people who, by sheer strength of reputation, will attract outstanding employees to your business in the future. People who provide an aura of success in terms of their achievements and past achievements in advance of your business having achieved those same types of things. You need somebody who works hard and responsive, a recurring theme with what we talked about with the board of directors. And you need somebody who's not shy about actually lending their name. For this to be in its most useful, they've got to be willing to be known as being associated with your business and showing a certain endorsement for what the company is doing, be it scientifically, in terms of product direction or otherwise. And generally the test of whether somebody would be a good advisor comes down to simply this. This is somebody you would absolutely love to have be a senior employee or be part of your executive management team, but simply is not affordable or attainable on that basis. A few things to be careful about with boards of advisors is objectively, after working with boards of advisors for a few years, only half of CEOs that put those advisory boards in place are happy with them. There are 4 leading issues to watch out for, and again, I'm giving this sort of downstream potential as the basis for informing your upstream thinking about whether and when to do this and who to bring on. Ongoing responsiveness is just about always the #1 issue. Attention wanes. That advisor that was really responsive when they were first brought on board and were most enthusiastic, well, a year later, they're not so responsive. Other things have taken on some of their time. So you've got to make sure that you are of the same mind about that. Advisors taking the time offline to fully contextualize the company's circumstances. It's one thing to call up an advisor and get some input on a point issue that you have, but if you have to also spend a whole lot of time educating or re-educating them on all of the goings-on of the company and the competitive environment since the last time you had an in-depth session with them, you're not getting much value for time out of that. The advisor has to be taking time offline from you to make sure that they're staying abreast of the company and its circumstances. The interpersonal chemistry has got to be there, and advisors quite often are guilty of self-interested behavior where they view their interaction with that promising young company as the basis for trying to get additional research work, additional consulting work, a lot of other things, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not uncommon to find entrepreneurs disappointed with the level of self-interest that their advisors show over time. So really knowing or getting references on the people that you're thinking about engaging with in this type of role is very important. In general, you use a board of advisor in the higher investment stakes and higher risk startups. The startups that take millions of dollars to get funding to get to revenue, or ones that have very large regulatory hurdles and risks. They have a middling kind of use in intermediate businesses, which would often be in the case of enterprise software, consumer electronics, or industrial technologies. Formal boards of advisors generally are not recommended in low investment stakes businesses, which would characterize a lot of consumer web services and mobile app startups today. You can still have informal advisors, somebody who really gets you, they get the space, you like how they test your thinking. Sure, sit down and have a coffee with them from time to time. But a formal advisory board in that type of situations, no, it's just going to move too fast to even take on the overhead of setting up this type of arrangement. I think I'll skip over this so that we can make time for the Q&A. But just by way of helping to distinguish the board of advisors from the board of directors, because of the propensity for attention to wane among boards of advisors, you're typically looking at even shorter term limits here, maybe 1 to 2 years. Those can be renewable for people who are staying engaged and giving you the pull that you're looking for. But you want to make it relatively easy in terms of the expectations that are set at the outset to move people on and off with relative fluidity. Especially if you have customers or partners on your advisory board, you want to remove the stigma of departure. Those people from those types of enterprises are just as guilty of the waning interest over time. So having those shorter term limits makes it easier to just naturally move those people in and out when conditions call for it. And I would recommend generally considering compensating not on a retainer basis or just a purely time-based basis for the board of advisors, but link it to deliverables such as preparing for a meeting, attending a meeting, even making a specific introduction or referral. I don't want to be too extreme in those suggestions that it becomes like a pellet feeder model, but you want to think about shifting the basis of compensation in that direction for sure with the board of advisors. And to finish up, I've given what I consider to be the leading sources of further information about both the board of directors, including a specific contextualization for the Canadian environment as opposed to what's going on south of the border or elsewhere. And I've as well provided some follow-up material on the board of advisors. As always, we're in the business of helping growing tech companies to start up, grow, and succeed. And I'm available for follow-up discussion. The best way to reach me by email is at those coordinates. And anybody who's in the room, anybody who's on the webcast, or if you have anybody you'd just like to refer this to because you feel that this would be relevant, I'm more than happy to take those calls and would love to help. So with that, that concludes my formal remarks. We've got a little over 10 minutes for Q&A. I would ask you to come to the microphone to ask your question as a courtesy to the people on the webcast so that they can hear the questions. And with that, please go ahead and fire away.
Could you just bring that previous page back? Because it was too quick to write down some of the...
Oh, the resources page.
These will be posted online. My back button is not.
Yeah, so we put all the slides are in the blog, which is launched on Monday. Thanks, David. That was actually the best presentation I've ever seen in terms of the stages, how the board responsibilities change. I've never seen it in that in depth. That was great.
Thank you.
I have lots of questions to start with, and a couple comments. Excellent talk, precise, practical, and very informative. One of the questions is, what happens when, I think a lot of people think the board of advisors is what you have when you can't pay or you can't compensate people to help. So is there a difference if you put up a board of advisors that you can't compensate, or how do you compensate them if you're not making any money, or how does that work?
In the case of a board of advisors, there is no obligation to pay if you have people who just are naturally enthusiastic about you or what they're doing, or they want to give back. There's no hard and fast obligation that it be a compensated relationship, at least in a monetary sense. But going a step beyond that, you still often have a situation that young companies would like to have advisors where the company really does have the moral authority to ask the advisors to do some legwork. And so in those situations, the most common form of compensation is through equity or equity rights in the company. There's a whole other discussion about what is the appropriate vehicle for delivering compensation in that form. But for companies that do not have revenues or cash flow, for companies that have not yet raised big fundraising rounds, who still need to compensate their advisors in some monetary sense, the typical way that it's done is through equity rights, very similar to how you would have stock options for very early stage employees, where there may be little or no cash compensation at that point in the venture.
Great. So we'll go to the floor, maybe on my left first, where there's two people. That's you.
Oh, all right. I got it. Really informative presentation. Thanks so much. I'm Jason, and I'm just wondering, it might be kind of a outlying example, but I think it's a pretty big one, and I don't know all the details, but I've heard that Steve Jobs was removed by his own board, and then sometime later, like, reestablished himself.
Yes.
So I was wondering, like, is that going to happen to me? When what's with, I'd love some feedback or some detail on that if you could offer anything.
So I'll just speak of one role in particular to keep the answer reasonably concise. So in the case of the CEO, the fact is, once there is a board of directors, the board has the right and the obligation to hire and fire the CEO. So there's related forms of influence through shareholder voting as to how one agrees upon the slate of directors that will form the board. So it's a complex dynamic as to whether and how a board does that, especially if the CEO is a very large shareholder in the business. But stepping back from the ownership issue and the shareholder approval of the board issue, once a board is in place, if the board in its independent and deliberate judgment feels that the CEO is not doing the job that the CEO should to lead the business for the best interests of the business, the board has the ability and has the obligation to remove the CEO and replace.
Okay, thanks.
Next question.
Hi, Dave. Question on Board of Advisors. I am an early stage startup. Question, am I ready to go for a Board of Directors, or I should put together a Board of Advisors first before I even contemplate to go to starting a Board of Directors?
It's so the question is, at a very early stage, is it best to start with a board of advisors before graduating to having a fully constituted board of directors? And my answer would be that there is no defined formula for what is right, but if there is no pressing need to have a board of directors immediately, the board of advisors does provide more flexibility and more control for the founders to feel their way into and get up and running with an advisory relationship. It's a little easier environment to learn in if you have not worked in that type of environment before. Whereas once there's a board of directors, there are all of these immediate duties and obligations. Now, sometimes in very capital-intensive startups where a substantial amount of outside capital is needed to get going almost from the word go, the investors will insist on having a board of directors and having representation on that board. So depending on the startup circumstances, it may not be entirely within the control of the founders as to whether that happens or not. But assuming that an early stage company is not under an obligation or an outside influence to immediately start with a board of directors, there's no reason that you can't start with a board of advisors and work into that behavior that way.
So what you mean is, in layman's term, if I want to bootstrap, I can wait to have a board of director.
That is correct. As a legal matter, even if you are incorporated, if you are a private company, you are only obligated by law to have one director, and that director can be the founder. So that as a practical matter, while there is a legal board of directors, which is just the founder, you're not answering to anybody else. Nobody else can hire or fire you. So the board is a singularity in that case. It's only later on, as the number of directors expands beyond the founder, that these other issues and obligations in practical terms become more significant.
So in summary, bootstrapping, no need to have a board of director. If I go for angel investing or VC funding, yes, we need a board of director.
In general, yes.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
You're welcome.
A question from the webcast. If you have more than one founder, who goes on the board? And if you have more than one, like the board of directors, and if you have more than one founder, can they all be on the board of advisors?
So on the question of can there be more than one director, more than one founder on the board of directors at the inception of an incorporated business, the answer is yes. You can put any number of founders. Now, the issue you tend to get into later on is that if there's a whole bunch of founders that are on the board of directors and an outside investor comes in that wants a board representation, they may want more voting influence than just being one vote in a 6 or 7 person board in kind of an extreme example. So the greater issue that I would recommend people think about in terms of a multiply populated board of directors with a lot of founders at the outset is think about what happens when you start bringing in outside investors or other constituencies that want board representation, because they're going to want their votes to mean something. And for that to be the case, they're going to have to reconcile either the number of directors or alternatively the voting rights of different directors, but it won't just stay that way.
Okay, I'm just conscious of the time. It's almost 7, so we'll take those last 2 questions and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you, David. I have a two-part question. One is the equity distribution for the Board of Advisors subject to the same dilution as that for the Board of Directors? And secondly, could you very briefly please talk about the equity distribution versus, or the relationship between equity and voting rights for the Board of Directors and how that changes over time?
Okay, I'll start with the first part of that. So this was, what would a typical equity allocation be for an equity compensated Board of Advisor versus a director? In general, advisors are compensated at about half the rate. So if directors, in a typical case of an early stage business, would be getting between 0.5% and 1% of the fully diluted, issued, and outstanding shares of the company on a 4-year vesting schedule, advisors would be getting or gaining equity rights at about half that rate per unit of time. But typically, advisors would have an even shorter tenure, so it ends up playing even less for the advisors. So that's the compensation piece. I've just dealt with on a pure equity kind of basis.
Same dilution. Subject to the same dilution as the Board of Directors. Okay.
In the case of equity rights versus voting rights, by contract, through a unanimous shareholders agreement, it is possible to arbitrarily set voting rates independent from equity rights. And the typical case of this would be preference shares that a venture capitalist would insist upon customarily, where they will have veto rights over certain matters that routinely or by statute the Board of Directors as a whole would have influence over. So there are ways by contract, certainly through the unanimous shareholders agreement, to reapportion equity rights and voting rights. There are some boundaries on that, but in general, the answer is yes, that can be done, and it is done routinely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Last question.
No
Hey,
pressure.
David, thanks for the talk. I think it's a very daunting theme for entrepreneurs. But in particular for young entrepreneurs like myself, I find a fear that I don't know if it's a shared fear. But a friend of mine, after she got seed funding, then because she was so young, then eventually she had this bad relationship within the board because basically based on age. Like she would feel that nobody was taking her seriously, even though she was a founder, because she was in her early 20s, and normally all other people would be older than her, and eventually it made her lose total control of her entrepreneurship. So I don't know if there's any advice or any strategy that one can follow to avoid these age-related tensions that could undermine a healthy board.
My reaction is I don't think that age is necessarily the issue. It may be a contributing factor, but in general, you want to know your directors or your director candidates before you bring them on board as a founder or as an entrepreneur. In much the same way that you would reference check employees or candidate employees before you would bring them on board, bringing a director on is a very big opportunity, but it can be a big issue for a company as well. So understanding who you're potentially getting into that business relationship with and doing as much research on them as they do on you before coming together is important. But I would also point back to some of the things that we've talked about in the presentation, which is the way to keep people in sync as the relationship develops and to keep small issues from getting into be much bigger ones that start taking on a personality dimension is regular feedback and being candid and having people who have the conviction and frankly the courage to have those discussions, have them regularly, discuss the good and bad equally. That's the way to keep things on track. But at the end of the day, there can be situations where having done all of that the right way, there still may be a breaking point where Maybe there are issues with the board, maybe there are issues with the founders, but finally it means that the only path forward is for one or the other to step out of that relationship. So I wouldn't view it as necessarily a sign that somebody dropped the ball. This is very often a natural outcome in very demanding, dynamic circumstances, age aside, and that is part of the basket of considerations that any entrepreneur, including young, should be thinking about as they think about developing their business in a way that would require that they take on a board of directors.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Your slides were great, and we had to go through a couple of them really fast, so they will be posted. The Mars blog on Monday has a link to the video and the slides if anybody would like to see them. Thank you very much for a great presentation.
Thank you, everyone.